Hi, I'm Amanda Baxter of Shiny Dime Fibers. In my shop, I have a selection of pre-wound weaving warps that are ready to go on a loom. If you've never used a pre-wound warp before, especially if you've only used a direct warping method for a rigid Heddle loom, this demo will help clarify what to do. You can use this method on a rigid Heddle or treadle loom, but I'm going to demonstrate on a rigid Heddle. You will learn how to use and hold the pre-wound cross, which is there to help organize the threads for you to make threading easier. So let's get started. First up, centering your weaving. This will help with weaving your project more evenly, as the Heddle will be more balanced when you beat your weft, and it will be a bit easier to create nicer selvages. I quickly find the center of my Heddle or reed with a tape measure by measuring the total length, folding the tape in half, and then marking the center. Now for a bit of calculation. Divide the width of your weaving by half so you know where to begin threading. So in this case, I'm weaving an 8-inch wide scarf, so I'm going to mark 4 inches left of center and 4 inches right of center. This will tell me where to thread in order to center my weaving. I got a little bit caught up in what I was doing to realize that my weaving is actually going to be a little bit wider than 8 inches, so bear with me. When you see me threading, you'll notice that my scarf ends up being just a little bit off center, but it'll still be centered enough to serve my purposes. Here I have a warp that I painted in my online workshop. More details about that later. It's chained just like all of the warps are chained when I sell them to keep them from being unruly and long. It's a temporary crochet chain. Once you undo the beginning a certain way, it will come right apart. Here is where the cross is. I mark the cross with an X so that you can find it easily. So the X end is the end you're going to undo first. So you pull it through the loop, and then you'll actually pull that end through the loop again, as I'm going to demonstrate here. And once you do that, the chain will come undone immediately. You just pull on it and off it goes. If you pull the long end through the loop again, it will stop the chain from coming undone. So if you don't want to undo the entire chain right away, then just pull that through the loop again. Let's learn how to handle the cross. The way I tie my cross, there are 3 knots. The first big knot we are going to cut, and the second 2 knots we're going to use to pull the cross open. Attempting to cut, should probably get some sharper scissors. Alright, so that's cut. Now I'm going to grab those 2 knots and I'm going to yank on the cross, and it's going to pull the cross open. So there you see it's starting to open up, and then I can use my fingers to kind of finish opening that up and separating the threads out. Once the threads are completely separated, insert the thumb and pointer finger of your non-dominant hand through the opening. This hand is going to hold the yarn, the other hand is going to do all the threading. Make sure to cut the ends of all of the threads from the end of the warp. So you could have done this before taking care of the cross. I just forgot until this moment. So I'm going to let go of that cross real quick, and I'm going to cut the end, and that's going to change this. It's actually a loop of threads, and I'm going to cut the end off so that it becomes a whole bunch of individual threads. There's a secondary choke tie just below that I use to hold my threads in place while I'm dyeing. You could cut it off if you wanted to, but it won't get in your way if you leave it there. In fact, it might help you keep your threads from going all over the place. So you don't have to cut that one out, you can just leave it. Once the end is cut and you have the cross on your thumb and pointer finger, you can remove the cross threads. You'll simply cut those 2 knots and then just pull the threads out. Once those threads are out, give the warp a little bit of a tug on all sides to help loosen that cross up so you can see the individual threads. So you can see there now all the threads are lying and they cross each other, so it makes it easier for you to find the thread that you want to thread, and it puts it all in order for you. In my case, I'm going to be threading 2 threads per hole and slot, or per dent. So each time I grab threads, I'm going to grab 2. Then that choke tie is going to hold the threads together, so I just need to pull it through that choke tie, and now I have my first 2 threads to thread into my heddle. Grabbing my heddle hook and going in to start threading. The markers I put in place when I measured the center of the reed tell me where to begin threading. Where you start threading is up to you. I would typically choose to start on the right side and work my way left, since the cross is in my left hand. I'm going left to right because where I placed the camera, but it works either way. I didn't really mention before, but I've chosen to clamp the heddle or the reed to a table to work. It's a little bit easier to work with if it's directly in front of you, so you can see it more closely, but you don't have to. You could do this while the heddle or the reed is on the loom. I just think it's a little bit easier to do it this way. So I'm threading 2 threads at a time. Each time I go to the cross, I grab the top 2 threads on the cross, and then I thread it into the rigid heddle. I'm going to be honest here, I'm far more familiar with floor looms than I am rigid heddles. This is only the 2nd or 3rd time I've threaded this rigid heddle, so if I use terminology that's not quite right, or if I'm threading slightly different than you're used to, it's from the way that I'm used to threading a loom. Grabbing the 2 threads that I need off the top of the X. If a thread or 2 comes undone from that X, that's okay. The X is primarily there to keep the threads organized for you, but if 1 or 2 threads ends up a little bit out of order, that's okay. Now, if you lose a significant amount of your cross or the whole cross, you're going to end up having some trouble later when you go to thread your loom. It's going to be a lot more tangled when you try to thread it from front to back on your loom. So don't lose the cross. Just if you lose a thread or 2, that's fine. Just try to keep it maintained as best as you can. Now let's say you're threading along and then, you have to go to the bathroom, the doorbell rings, the phone goes off, and you need to stop threading. All you have to do is just make sure that you somehow maintain that cross opening while you're gone. So I'm just going to lay it there and I'm just going to keep it open. And when I come back, I'm going to put it back on my hand just like I did before. If you think you're going to be gone for a significant amount of time, I would recommend tying a thread around that center just so that if anything happens, you don't lose your cross. This is really important. Make sure you put it back on your hand exactly the way that you set it down. You don't want to twist the yarn and accidentally put a twist halfway across threading. If everything looks good, there isn't an added twist, you just go right back to it. Once the yarn is threaded, I straighten out the yarn a bit by grabbing the long end and sort of pulling the threaded ends to even out the threads. It'll make it a bit easier to tie up when the ends are a little bit more even. So you can see I'm getting ready to kind of pull and brush them out a little bit. And when I do that, it sort of straightens out the colorway, it straightens out the yarn, and it evens out the ends that I threaded. Now that that's done, I'm going to undo my clamps and I'm going to take the heddle or the reed to my loom. Here I'm going to add a zip tie to sort of choke hold the long end of the warp. This is a reusable zip tie that I use a lot in my studio so that I can zip things closed and then reuse them. I'm going to use it to hold the warp in place while I tie the back of the warp onto the back beam. I am going to wrap the yarn around the back warp stick, or whatever you call the rod connected to your back beam, then tie an overhand knot. I like to use overhand knots on the back beam because it's the most secure knot. It won't slip. I'll show you how to do this from the back of the loom here in a second, but I just want to show you really quick. So I'm wrapping around the back beam and the back warp stick, and then I'm tying an overhand knot on one side of the warp. I'll tie it on the other side of the warp. I'm trying to maintain the width of the weaving on the back stick as much as possible. So I'm tying about 8 inches apart, and then I will work on the threads in the middle. Let's take a closer look at how I'm knotting this. I'm grabbing a roughly 1-inch section of yarn, splitting it in half, wrapping the yarn around the stick, and bringing the sections up around the outside of the section, left to left, right to right. Then bringing all the ends back together to tie an overhand knot. Watch that all the ends in your section get included in this knot. Sometimes a thread might come up a little short and it doesn't get caught in the knot. You might need to pull that thread to be a little bit longer, or you need to make your knot so that it includes all the threads. Otherwise you'll end up with a thread coming loose and coming out of your weaving. Again, I'm splitting the section in half, wrapping the right side around to the right and the left side around and to the left. Then I'll bring all of those ends back together in the middle to form an overhand knot. I try to make my overhand knot as close to the ends as possible. The longer your ends are in the overhand knot, the shorter your warp. So I try to keep as much warp for weaving as possible. So if I think there's a thread there that got a little bit short, I gave it a pull so that I can make these overhand knots with ends as short as possible. Successfully tied on to that back beam, to that back warp stick. I'm scooching everything out to make it as even as possible and as straight towards the reed as possible. And then I'm going to come to the front of the loom and I'm going to warp as I would normally. And I'm starting to think that maybe tying a bow with a normal piece of thread would be easier than trying to undo that zip tie, but there it goes. All right, and then I can undo. I had wrapped the warp around that front beam just to hold it in place. I'm going to take it out, and then I'm going to pull the remainder of the warp through that chain so that I can undo the chain. Then I am going to warp the loom just as I would typically. So I'm loosening up that first loop, and then I can pull the rest of the chain through that loop. And then I can undo the chain. You will will need to sort of hand brush your threads out from time to time while you warp this way. Because you tied knots onto that back beam rather than directly wrapping around it. If you're used to warping a rigid Heddle loom, you usually do a direct tie method that wraps around that back beam. But because you are tying knots of individual threads, they sometimes get shifted a little bit. So as you're winding this warp, you're going to have to straighten those threads out from time to time. I made a terrible decision to record this whole thing in my studio where there are no tables that I could clamp this loom to. So it's going to be a little bit difficult for me to record this and also try to keep the loom from just being pulled right off the table, but we will make it work. I like using 70-pound or thicker craft paper to cover the back beam. Because we tied knots on the back beam, we will need to cover them up well so they don't create tension issues. They will create lumps that will build up as you wrap the back beam, causing hills and valleys that will mess with your tension. So here I folded the paper in half to create a little bit more of a cover for those knots. And then I'm going to place it on top of those knots as I wrap the warp around that back beam to cover them up. You really need to be able to clamp your loom down if you're going to do this, because this is really hard to wind when the loom is trying to move away from me or move off the table. But every time I wind the warp around that back beam once, I like to give it a little bit of a tug to pull that paper down and to pull the warp flat and tight around that back beam so it doesn't create any sort of bubbles in the paper. From time to time you'll find a loose thread that you can cut out of the warp. I use these just to keep the warp sort of organized, to keep it from going all over the place, especially in the dye process. So that's just scrap thread. You can cut it out and remove it. Brushing out, winding, pulling tight. Brushing out, winding, pulling tight. You just do that from one end of the warp to the other. Did I forget to set that back beam up higher? Yes, I did. Now I'm finally doing it. Finally, when you get to the other end of the warp, you get to cut the other end off. You can cut this at the choke tie if you want to. I'm a little bit anal and I like to cut at the very end to get every last little inch out of a warp that I can, but I'm not even sure it's worth the effort. So I'm going to cut the ends off, and now I have all individual threads, and then I'm going to cut that little choke tie out. I think what I'm going to do here is cut the threads a little bit more even so it's a little easier to know where to tie my knots. There's always a little bit of shifting that happens, especially since you're working with individual threads instead of a direct tie-up method. So I cut it a little bit even. I'm not going to go for exact perfect haircut here, but just so that there isn't these extra long lengths in my way. Once you've got that somewhat evened out, use your favorite method to tie on to the front beam as you would any other warp. And that's how you would put a pre-wound warp on a rigid Heddle loom. This colorway is called Mardi Gras. If you're interested in watching me paint this very warp or learning how to paint this colorway yourself, make sure you sign up for the waitlist for my next online workshop opening where I teach you how to paint plant-based yarn from home. I hope this demo was helpful. Feel free to email me if you have further questions. Thanks for watching. Pre-wound warp, pre-wound warp, pre-wound warp, pre-wound warp, pre-wound.